The sound of Lucas crying wasn't what woke me at 3 in the morning. It was the silence that followed. That abrupt, terrifying quiet that every mother learns to fear more than any scream. I shot upright in bed, my heart already racing before my feet hit the cold hardwood floor. Tyler's side of the bed was empty, sheets thrown back carelessly. Down the hall, I could hear his voice, low and dangerous in a way that made my stomach clench. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Shut up, just shut up, he was hissing. You're fine, stop being dramatic. I crept toward the nursery, bare feet silent on the floor. Through the crack in the door, I saw him standing over Lucas's crib, our 6-month-old son pressed against his shoulder. But something was wrong with the way Tyler was holding him. Too tight. Too rough. Lucas wasn't crying anymore, but his little body was rigid with fear. Tyler? I whispered, pushing the door open wider. He spun around, and I saw it then. The mark on Lucas's cheek. Red and angry, perfectly shaped like Tyler's palm. My baby's face was swollen, tears still wet on his tiny cheeks, but he'd gone silent. That kind of silence that comes after shock, after pain too big for such a small body to process. He wouldn't stop crying, Tyler said, his voice flat, matter-of-fact. Like he was explaining why he'd turned off a noisy television. I barely touched him. Kids need to learn. I stared at my husband, this man I'd loved, this man I'd trusted with our child, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. Something that would never, ever shift back. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I stepped forward with my arms outstretched, my voice steady as morning tide. Give him to me. Tyler hesitated for just a moment, then placed Lucas in my arms. My son's little body melted against mine, still trembling. I could feel the heat radiating from the mark on his face, could see how his left eye was already beginning to swell. Claire, you're overreacting, Tyler said, running his hand through his hair. It was just a tap. He's fine. I looked down at Lucas, then back at Tyler. Get out of this room. What? Get out, now. He left, muttering something about hormones and new mothers, but I barely heard him. All of my attention was focused on my son, on the way he clung to me like I was the only safe thing in his small world. Because maybe I was. Maybe I was the only thing standing between him and a man who thought hitting a baby was acceptable discipline. I carried Lucas to our bedroom, locked the door behind me, and reached for my phone. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through my contacts, past neighbors and mom friends and pediatrician numbers, until I found the one I needed. The number I hadn't called in 3 months, not since Lucas was born. Admiral Victoria Morrison. My sister. 8 years older than me, 22 years in the Navy, currently stationed at Naval Station Norfolk. The woman who taught me how to throw a punch when I was 12, and how to read people's intentions before they even knew them themselves. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. It was past 3 in the morning on the East Coast, but military phones never really sleep. Claire? Victoria's voice was immediately alert, no trace of sleep. What's wrong? I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, I started crying. Quiet, desperate tears that I tried to muffle against Lucas's soft hair. Claire, talk to me. Right now. Are you hurt? Tyler hit Lucas, I whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. He hit our baby. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for exactly 3 seconds. I could almost hear Victoria's mind shifting into what she called command mode, that clinical, strategic thinking that had carried her through 2 decades of military service. How bad? She asked, her voice deadly calm. There's a handprint on his face. His eye is swelling. Where is Tyler now? Downstairs, I think. I locked us in the bedroom. Good. Do not unlock that door. Do you have your camera? I blinked, confused. What? Your phone camera. Turn it on. Document everything. Every mark. Every bruise. The time. The date. Do it now, while the evidence is fresh. With shaking hands, I switched to camera mode and carefully photographed Lucas's face from multiple angles. The mark was even more pronounced in the harsh light of the phone's flash, a clear outline of adult fingers across my baby's cheek and jaw. Done, I whispered. Now listen to me very carefully, Victoria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. I'm flying out tomorrow. Tonight, actually. But before I get there, you need to do exactly what I tell you. First, you're going to take Lucas to the emergency room. Not in the morning. Right now. But Tyler will do nothing. Because Tyler doesn't get a vote anymore. This stopped being about Tyler the moment he put his hands on a baby. You're going to tell them exactly what happened. You're going to let them document everything. And you're going to ask them to call Child Protective Services. The words hit me like cold water. CPS. Documentation. Emergency room. This was really happening. My marriage, my life, my carefully constructed world in Pensacola was about to explode into pieces. Victoria, I can't. What if they take Lucas away? What if? Claire. Her voice cut through my panic like a blade. Look at me. Well, listen to me. You are not the problem here. You are not the one who needs to be afraid. Tyler is. Because he just made the biggest mistake of his life, and he doesn't even know it yet. I met Tyler Bradford at a teachers' conference in Jacksonville 3 years ago. I was presenting on early childhood development. Nervous as anything because I'd only been teaching for 2 years. And he was there representing his defense contracting company, looking for educational partnerships. He was charming in that easy, confident way that some men have, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room worth talking to. He approached me after my presentation, introduced himself with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and told me I'd given the most insightful talk he'd heard all day. We ended up having coffee that stretched into dinner, and dinner that led to a walk along the riverfront that lasted until nearly midnight. He was funny, attentive, interested in my work in a way that felt genuine. When he asked for my number, I gave it to him without hesitation. Our courtship was a whirlwind of weekend trips and long phone conversations. Tyler lived in Pensacola, about 3 hours from Jacksonville. But he made the drive every Friday evening for 2 months straight. He'd arrive with flowers, usually lilies because I'd mentioned once that they were my favorite, and we'd spend the weekend exploring museums or trying new restaurants or just walking on the beach. He proposed 8 months later on the same pier where we'd had our first long conversation. The ring was beautiful, a simple solitaire that caught the sunset perfectly, and when he dropped to one knee and asked me to marry him, I said yes without a moment's hesitation. I was 26, ready to start a family, ready to build something lasting with someone who seemed to love me as much as I loved him. The wedding was small, held at a historic inn in St. Augustine with about 50 guests. Victoria flew in from Virginia, resplendent in her dress blues, and walked me down the aisle because our parents had died in a car accident when I was 22. She was the only family I had left, and seeing her there in full uniform, proud and protective, made me feel like everything was going to be all right. Victoria and Tyler had met only twice before the wedding, but they seemed to get along well enough. She was naturally suspicious of anyone I dated, a trait that came from years of looking out for her little sister, but Tyler passed her initial tests. He was respectful, employed, and clearly devoted to me. What more could she ask for? He seemed solid, she told me the night before the wedding as we sat on the inn's veranda, sharing a bottle of wine. A little too smooth for my taste, but some people are just naturally charming. Is that your way of giving him your blessing? I asked, bumping her shoulder with mine. Victoria smiled, but there was something thoughtful in her expression. You know I trust your judgment, Claire. You've always been the better judge of character between the two of us. I just want you to remember that people can change, especially after they think they have you locked down. Marriage changes the dynamic. At the time, I thought she was just being her usual cautious self. Victoria had never married, had never even had a serious long-term relationship that I knew of. Her career had always come first, and I assumed her warning came from a place of unfamiliarity with domestic life, rather than any real insight about Tyler. How wrong I was. The first year of marriage was everything I'd hoped it would be.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Tyler and I settled into a rhythm in his house in Bayshore Heights, a quiet suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes from the naval base. The house was larger than anything I'd ever lived in, a 4-bedroom colonial with a big backyard and a screened-in porch where we'd have coffee every morning before he left for work. I transferred to a local elementary school, teaching 3rd grade, and threw myself into creating a home for us. Tyler was supportive of my career, proud when parents requested me specifically for their children, understanding when I had to stay late for parent conferences or school events. We talked about starting a family, agreeing that we wanted to wait at least a year to get settled first. When I got pregnant 14 months after the wedding, we were both thrilled. Tyler converted the spare bedroom into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and assembling the crib with the kind of focused determination that made me fall in love with him all over again. He came to every doctor's appointment, read pregnancy books, and talked to my belly every night before we went to sleep. "Hey there, little one," he'd whisper, his hand warm on my growing stomach. "Your dad here. Just wanted you to know we're getting everything ready for you up here." I felt so lucky, so blessed to have found a partner who was as excited about parenthood as I was. When Lucas was born after 18 hours of labor, Tyler cried right along with me. He held our son with such tenderness, such awe, that I thought my heart might burst from happiness. "He's perfect," Tyler whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Claire, look what we made. He's absolutely perfect." For the first few months, Tyler was everything I could have asked for in a father. He took his turn with night feedings, changed diapers without complaint, and spent hours just holding Lucas and talking to him about everything and nothing. When I went back to work part-time when Lucas was 3 months old, Tyler adjusted his schedule so he could be home in the afternoons. But somewhere around Lucas's 4th month, things began to shift. Subtle at first. Tyler started getting irritated when Lucas cried, especially during his favorite television shows or when he was trying to work from home. He'd make comments about babies being, quote, manipulative or attention-seeking, theories I'd never heard him express before. "He's just testing us," Tyler would say when Lucas fussed during feedings. "Babies are smarter than people give them credit for. They learn what works." I tried to explain that infant development didn't work that way, that babies cried because it was their only form of communication. But Tyler would just shrug and say something about maternal instincts making mothers too soft. It was the kind of comment that made me uncomfortable, but not enough to cause a real argument. Not yet. The first time Tyler raised his voice at Lucas, our son was about 5 months old. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard it from the living room, Tyler's voice sharp and angry. "Stop it! Just stop crying! There's nothing wrong with you!" I rushed in to find Tyler standing over Lucas's bouncy seat, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Lucas was red-faced and screaming, probably overstimulated and tired. "Hey," I said softly, scooping Lucas up and holding him against my shoulder. "It's okay, baby. Mama's here." Lucas quieted almost immediately, his little body relaxing as I swayed gently back and forth. "See?" Tyler said, his voice tight with frustration. He was just being dramatic. He stops the second you pick him up. "He's a baby, Tyler. He doesn't know how to be dramatic. He was probably just tired." Tyler shook his head, already walking away. "Whatever you say, Claire. You're the expert." There was something in his tone that made me uneasy, a dismissiveness that felt different from our usual disagreements. But Lucas was calm now, and dinner needed to be finished, so I filed the moment away and tried to forget about it. I should have paid attention. I should have recognized the warning signs. The way Tyler's patience with Lucas grew thinner by the day. The way he started avoiding baby care tasks altogether, claiming he wasn't good at it like I was. I should have noticed how he began staying later at work, coming home after Lucas was already asleep, or how he started taking business trips that seemed suspiciously timed to coincide with Lucas's fussy periods. But I was tired, overwhelmed with the demands of new motherhood and trying to balance work and home life. I told myself that Tyler was just adjusting to fatherhood differently than I was, that some people took longer to bond with babies. I made excuses for his growing irritability, his increasing absence from baby care duties, his subtle but constant criticisms of my parenting choices. "You're spoiling him," became Tyler's favorite refrain. "He needs to learn to self-soothe. You can't just pick him up every time he makes a sound. You're too soft with him, Claire. Kids need structure, discipline. They need to know who's in charge." "He's 6 months old, Tyler." I'd respond, but my protests felt weaker each time. Tyler had a way of making his opinions sound like established facts, and I found myself second-guessing my own instincts more and more. The night Tyler hit Lucas wasn't the first time I'd felt afraid. For weeks, I'd been noticing changes in my husband that I couldn't quite name or categorize. A hardness around his eyes when Lucas cried, a tension in his shoulders when he held our son, an edge to his voice when he talked about baby-related expenses or interrupted sleep or the way our social life had changed since becoming parents. "We never go anywhere anymore," he'd complained just the week before. "All our friends are out having fun, and we're stuck here because of a 6-month-old who doesn't even know we exist." "He knows we exist," I'd said quietly. "And this phase won't last forever. All new parents go through this adjustment." "Some adjustment," Tyler had muttered, more like a prison sentence. The words had stung, but I'd tried to rationalize them. Tyler had always been social, used to going out with colleagues after work, taking weekend trips, being spontaneous. Parenthood was a bigger adjustment for some people than others. I kept telling myself he'd come around, that once Lucas got a little older and more interactive, Tyler would remember why we'd wanted a baby in the first place. But that night, standing in the nursery and seeing my baby's face marked by his father's hand, I realized that some adjustments aren't adjustments at all. They're revelations. Tyler hadn't changed since becoming a father. The capacity for violence had always been there, hidden beneath charm and patience, and carefully constructed facades. Parenthood had just stripped away the pretense. As I held Lucas in our locked bedroom, his little body still trembling against mine, I thought about all the times Victoria had tried to teach me to recognize danger. Growing up as military dependents, we'd moved constantly, always the new kids, always having to quickly assess which classmates were friends and which were threats. Victoria had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to spot the ones who would smile to your face and then push you down on the playground the moment no adult was watching. "People tell you who they are, Claire," she'd said when I was maybe 14, after a particularly brutal lesson about a friend who turned out to be anything but. "They tell you with their actions, their micro-expressions, the way they treat people who can't do anything for them. You just have to learn how to listen with your eyes instead of your heart." I'd thought I was listening. I'd thought I knew Tyler, understood him, could predict his reactions and responses. But I'd been listening with my heart instead of my eyes, and now my baby was paying the price for my blindness. The emergency room at Gulf Coast Children's Medical Center was surprisingly busy for 4 in the morning. I'd waited until I heard Tyler's car pull out of the driveway, then quickly dressed Lucas and myself, and drove through the empty streets of Pensacola with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The triage nurse, a woman about my age with kind eyes and quick, efficient movements, took one look at Lucas's face and immediately ushered us into a private room. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked, her voice gentle but professional. I took a deep breath and told her everything. The crying, Tyler's frustration, the sound of skin hitting skin, the mark on Lucas's face. The nurse listened without interruption, making notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Mrs. Bradford," she said when I finished, "I need to ask you this directly. Do you feel safe at home?" The question hung in the air between us. Safe. Such a simple word, but suddenly I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt truly safe in my own house. Had it been before Lucas was born? Before Tyler started making those comments about spoiled babies and maternal softness? Or had the feeling of safety been an illusion all along? I don't know, I whispered, and somehow that felt like the most honest thing I'd said in months. Dr. Rachel Kim, the pediatrician on call, examined Lucas with careful thoroughness. She photographed the mark from multiple angles, measured the dimensions, noted the color and texture. She was gentle but clinical, explaining each step as she worked. The pattern is consistent with an adult palm print, she told me, showing me the measurements on her tablet. Given the size and force required to create this level of inflammation, there's no question this was intentional contact, not accidental. Intentional contact. The medical terminology for what Tyler had done to our son felt both too clinical and not severe enough. This wasn't just intentional contact. This was a grown man hitting a baby. This was my husband, choosing violence against the most vulnerable person in our family. I'm required to report this to Child Protective Services, Dr. Kim continued. They'll want to interview you and conduct a safety assessment. I'm also recommending that Lucas stay here for observation, just to make sure there are no underlying injuries we can't see. I nodded, feeling like I was watching someone else's life unfold. CPS. Hospital observation. Safety assessments. This was really happening. My marriage was really over. Tyler had really crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. My phone buzzed with a text message. Victoria. Boarding the plane now. Land in Pensacola at 0800. Do not go home alone. Stay at the hospital until I get there. I showed the message to Dr. Kim, who nodded approvingly. Military family? My sister's a Navy Admiral, I said, surprised by the note of pride that crept into my voice despite everything. Dr. Kim's eyebrows rose slightly. Then you're in good hands. Military families know how to handle crises. As dawn broke over Pensacola, I sat in the hospital room, holding my sleeping son and waiting for Victoria to arrive. Lucas looked so small in the hospital bed, a tiny figure surrounded by medical equipment and monitoring devices. The mark on his face had darkened overnight, the handprint now clearly visible even to someone who didn't know what they were looking for. I thought about Tyler, probably waking up at home and realizing we were gone. Was he worried? Angry? Did he think I was overreacting, making a big deal out of nothing? Or did some part of him know that he'd crossed a line that would change everything? My phone had been buzzing with missed calls and text messages since about 6 in the morning. Tyler, asking where I was. Tyler, demanding that I bring Lucas home immediately. Tyler, accusing me of being dramatic and threatening to call the police if I didn't return with his son. I turned the phone face down and ignored it. Dr. Kim had already spoken to the police. They would be coming to interview me later that morning, and they'd also be paying Tyler a visit. The machinery was already in motion, systems designed to protect children already activating around my family. At exactly 8:15, I heard familiar footsteps in the hallway outside Lucas's room. Quick, purposeful strides that I'd been hearing my entire life. Victoria appeared in the doorway, still in her traveling clothes, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face set in an expression I'd seen only a few times before. It was the look she wore when someone had made a serious mistake and was about to face the consequences. She crossed the room in 3 steps and wrapped me in a hug that smelled like airport coffee and the faint scent of her favorite perfume. For the first time since the night before, I felt like I could breathe properly. Let me see him, she said quietly, releasing me and moving to Lucas's bedside. Victoria studied the mark on our son's face with the same clinical attention Dr. Kim had shown, but I could see the rage building behind her careful composure. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her hands, normally steady as stone, trembled just slightly as she touched Lucas's forehead. "How big is Tyler?" she asked, her voice deadly calm. "About 6'2", maybe 190, I said, confused by the question. Victoria nodded once, still staring at Lucas's face. And he used his full strength against a baby. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the tone she probably used when briefing subordinates on mission-critical information. "Victoria, I started, but she held up one hand. No, don't say anything yet. I need to think. She walked to the window and stared out at the parking lot for several long minutes. When she turned back to me, her expression had shifted into something I'd never seen before. Not just anger, not just protective big sister mode, but something harder and more focused. Something that looked like strategy. Claire, I need you to listen to me very carefully, she said, settling into the chair next to my bed. What happened last night wasn't a one-time thing. Men who hit babies don't just wake up one morning and decide to try it out. This is who Tyler is. This is who he's probably always been, underneath the charm. I opened my mouth to argue, to defend Tyler, to explain that he'd been under stress, that new parenthood was hard, that maybe if I'd been more understanding about his adjustment period, but the words died in my throat. Because deep down, I knew Victoria was right. The signs had been there. I'd just chosen not to see them. The good news, Victoria continued, is that Tyler just made a mistake that's going to cost him everything. The bad news is that he doesn't know it yet, which makes him dangerous. Men like Tyler don't give up their power willingly. When they realize they're losing control, they escalate. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to the tone she used when sharing classified information. So we're going to be very smart about this. We're going to use every resource available to us. And we're going to make sure that Tyler Bradford never gets the chance to put his hands on you or Lucas ever again. Through the window, I could see storm clouds gathering over the Gulf of Mexico, dark and ominous against the morning sky. A hurricane was building somewhere out over the water, and it was heading straight for shore. But for the first time since the night before, I wasn't afraid of the storm. I was ready for it. Because Victoria Morrison didn't just hold the rank of Admiral in the United States Navy. She held it because she'd spent 22 years learning how to win wars. And Tyler Bradford had just declared war on her family. The Child Protective Services office in downtown Pensacola smelled like burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant. Ms. Patricia Wells, the caseworker assigned to our family, was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that had seen too much but somehow managed to stay kind. She sat across from Victoria and me in a cramped conference room, Lucas sleeping peacefully in my arms, blissfully unaware that his entire future was being decided by adults with clipboards and legal authority. Mrs. Bradford, Ms. Wells began, consulting her notes. I've reviewed the hospital report and the police documentation from this morning. I need to ask you some questions about your home environment and your relationship with your husband. The questions came in waves, each one feeling more invasive than the last. How long had Tyler been irritable with Lucas? Had I ever seen him lose his temper before? Did he drink, use drugs? Did he have access to weapons? Had he ever threatened me or Lucas directly? The interrogation felt both necessary and humiliating, like being forced to admit that I'd failed at the most basic task of protecting my child. Victoria sat beside me throughout the interview, mostly silent but radiating a protective energy that reminded me of a guard dog waiting for a command to attack. Occasionally she would lean forward to clarify a timeline or add context to my answers, her military bearing lending weight to even the smallest details. Has your husband ever displayed controlling behavior? Ms. Wells asked, pen poised over her notepad. I hesitated. Controlling seemed like such a strong word, but as I thought about it, images flashed through my mind. Tyler monitoring my text messages under the guise of staying connected. Tyler insisting on managing our joint finances because he was, quote, better with numbers. Tyler gradually isolating me from old friends by always finding reasons why we couldn't attend social gatherings. Small things individually, but together they painted a picture I'd been too close to see clearly. Quote, yes, I admitted quietly. But I thought it was just his personality. He likes things organized, planned out. Victoria's expression didn't change, but I felt her stiffen slightly beside me. She'd probably recognized the pattern long before I had, filed it away as one more red flag I'd been too naive to notice. Mrs. Bradford, I'm going to be direct with you, Ms. Wells said, setting down her pen and looking me in the eye. Based on what I've documented here, I believe Lucas is in immediate danger if he returns to your home while your husband is present. I'm recommending emergency protective custody. The words hit me like a physical blow. Emergency protective custody. They were going to take Lucas away from me. I felt Victoria's hand close over mine, warm and steady, anchoring me before I could spiral into panic. "What does that mean exactly?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to demanding clear explanations from subordinates. "It means Lucas cannot return to the family home while Mr. Bradford has access," Ms. Wells explained. "Mrs. Bradford can maintain custody, but she needs to establish a safe living environment away from the perpetrator. Do you have somewhere you can stay?" I looked at Victoria, who nodded once. "She'll stay with me. I've arranged temporary housing on base. Military police provide security, and base access is highly restricted." Ms. Wells made another note. "That would be acceptable, provided Mrs. Bradford agrees to follow all court orders and attend all scheduled hearings. There will be a temporary custody hearing within 72 hours. As we left the CPS office, I felt like I was walking through someone else's life. Everything familiar had been stripped away in the span of 12 hours. My home, my marriage, my sense of safety, all gone. I was a single mother now, dependent on my sister's protection and the legal system's ability to keep my baby safe from his own father. "Victoria," I said as we walked toward her rental car, "what if they decide I'm an unfit mother too? What if they think I should have known, should have protected him better?" Victoria stopped walking and turned to face me. "Claire, listen to me. You did protect him. The moment you realized what Tyler was capable of, you got Lucas out of that house. You took him to the hospital. You called me. You did everything right." "But I married him," I whispered. "I brought this man into our lives. I thought he was safe." "Predators are good at hiding what they are," Victoria said firmly. "That's what makes them dangerous. Tyler fooled a lot of people, not just you. Even I thought he was just overly smooth, not actively harmful." We drove through Pensacola in relative silence, Lucas dozing in his car seat while I stared out the window at the city that was supposed to be my home. Everything looked different now, tainted by the knowledge that Tyler was out there somewhere, probably furious and looking for us. According to the police officer who'd interviewed me at the hospital, Tyler had become increasingly agitated when they'd informed him about the protective order. He'd demanded to know where we were, threatened to hire lawyers, insisted that I was having some kind of postpartum breakdown and couldn't be trusted with our son. "He's scared," Victoria observed, apparently reading my thoughts. "Good. Scared people make mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" Victoria glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "The kind that help us build a stronger case against him. Tyler's used to being in control, used to being the one with the power in your relationship. Right now he's realizing that control was always an illusion, and men like him don't handle that realization well." The temporary housing Victoria had arranged was a small apartment in the family quarters section of Naval Air Station Pensacola. It was basic but clean, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchenette, and a view of the flight line where training aircraft took off and landed throughout the day. Most importantly, it was behind multiple layers of security that Tyler couldn't penetrate without military authorization he'd never receive. "It's not much," Victoria said as she carried Lucas's car seat into the living room, "but it's safe. And safety is all that matters right now." I walked through the small space, touching unfamiliar furniture, and wondering how long we'd be here. Days? Weeks? Months? The uncertainty felt overwhelming, but underneath the anxiety was something I hadn't felt in longer than I cared to admit. Relief. For the first time in months, I didn't have to worry about Tyler's mood, Tyler's expectations, Tyler's barely contained frustration with our son. Lucas and I could exist here without walking on eggshells, without monitoring every sound for signs of approaching anger. That first night on base, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid, but because the absence of fear felt so foreign that my body didn't know how to relax. I lay in the narrow bed, listening to Lucas breathe in the portable crib beside me, marveling at how peaceful he seemed. Even as a baby, he'd somehow absorbed the tension in our house, but here he slept more deeply than he had in weeks. Victoria had taken leave from her duties in Norfolk, something that probably required significant bureaucratic maneuvering for someone at her level. She'd set up a temporary office in the apartment's 2nd bedroom, her laptop surrounded by legal documents, military regulations, and what looked like personnel files. "What are you working on?" I asked the next morning. finding her already dressed and caffeinated at 7 a.m. "Building a case," she said without looking up from her screen. Tyler made one crucial mistake when he hit Lucas. He didn't realize he was attacking the nephew of a Navy admiral with 22 years of experience navigating military and civilian legal systems. She turned her laptop toward me, showing me a spreadsheet that looked like a military operation plan. Tyler's employment history, his security clearance level, his supervisor's contact information, even his college disciplinary records. Victoria had been busy. "How did you get all this?" I asked, scrolling through the detailed information. "Tyler works for a defense contractor with Navy contracts," Victoria explained. "That makes him subject to certain background checks and behavioral standards that most civilians never have to worry about. His security clearance requires him to report any arrests, domestic violence charges, or CPS investigations. Failure to report is grounds for immediate termination and loss of clearance." I stared at the screen, beginning to understand the scope of what Victoria was planning. So when he gets arrested, he loses his job, his clearance, and his ability to work in defense contracting. Which means he loses the financial resources to fight us in court. It was brilliant and ruthless in equal measure, exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had carried Victoria through 2 decades of military service. She wasn't just protecting Lucas and me from Tyler. She was systematically dismantling his ability to cause future harm. The phone call came at 11:30 that morning. Tyler, calling from a number I didn't recognize, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Claire, this has gone far enough," he said without preamble. "You need to bring Lucas home right now. I've talked to a lawyer, and you can't just disappear with my son." Victoria was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, and I put the call on speaker at her gesture. "Tyler, I can't do that," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "There's a protective order in place." "A protective order based on lies and exaggerations," Tyler snapped. "I barely touched him, Claire. You're acting like I beat him with a baseball bat." "You hit a 6-month-old baby hard enough to leave a handprint on his face," I said quietly. "That's not barely touching him. Kids need discipline. They need to learn boundaries. You baby him too much, and now look what's happened. You've turned one moment of necessary correction into some kind of domestic violence case." Victoria leaned forward, her expression dangerous. She mouthed, "Keep him talking," and made a recording gesture with her hands. "Necessary correction?" I repeated, wanting to make sure Tyler's words were clearly captured. "Yes, necessary." Lucas was being manipulative, crying for attention when nothing was wrong with him. Sometimes babies need to learn that crying doesn't always get them what they want. I closed my eyes, feeling sick. Tyler genuinely believed what he was saying. In his mind, hitting a baby was reasonable parenting, and I was the one overreacting. "Tyler, he's 6 months old. He doesn't have the cognitive ability to be manipulative." "That's where you're wrong, Claire. Babies are smarter than you think. They test boundaries just like older kids do. If you don't establish authority early, you end up with spoiled, entitled children who think the world revolves around them." Victoria was taking notes rapidly, documenting every word Tyler said that could be used against him in court. The man was building the prosecution's case for them, too arrogant to realize how damaging his own words were. "Where are you staying?" Tyler asked suddenly. "I have a right to know where my son is." "You have a right to know that he's safe," I corrected. "You don't have a right to know his location while there's a protective order in place." "This is ridiculous, Claire. You're keeping me from my own child over nothing. When this all gets sorted out in court, you're going to look very foolish." The call ended abruptly, and I sat staring at my phone screen feeling drained. Victoria immediately connected her laptop to my phone and began downloading the recorded conversation. "That was perfect," she said grimly. "He just admitted to hitting Lucas and justified it as necessary discipline. No family court judge in the country is going to find that acceptable." But I felt no satisfaction in Tyler's self-incrimination. This was the man I'd married, the man I'd loved, the father of my child. Hearing him defend child abuse with such casual certainty was like discovering that I'd been sharing my bed with a stranger. How did I not see this? I asked Victoria. How did I live with him for 3 years and never realize he was capable of this? Victoria finished uploading the recording and turned to face me. Because he didn't want you to see it. Men like Tyler are experts at compartmentalization. They show you exactly what they want you to see, until they decide you don't have the power to leave. But I did have the power to leave. Did you? Victoria asked gently. Think about it, Claire. You were financially dependent on him. You'd moved away from all your friends and support systems. You'd left your job to be a stay-at-home mother. Tyler had systematically isolated you and made you dependent on him. If Lucas hadn't been born, if you hadn't had a child to protect, would you have found the strength to recognize what he was? The question hung in the air between us, uncomfortable and honest. I thought about the version of myself from 6 months ago, tired and isolated, second-guessing my own parenting instincts, because Tyler's confidence made me doubt my own competence. Would that woman have recognized abuse when it was directed at her instead of her child? I wasn't sure. The temporary custody hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at Escambia County Family Court. Victoria had arranged for Commander David Park, a Navy JAG officer, to represent me, while Tyler appeared with a civilian attorney who looked expensive and somewhat overdressed for family court. Judge Margaret Chen was a woman in her 60s who'd apparently seen every permutation of family dysfunction during her 20 years on the bench. She reviewed the case file with clinical efficiency, occasionally glancing up to study Tyler and me with sharp, assessing eyes. "Mr. Bradford," Judge Chen began, "you're here to contest the emergency protective order that was issued Monday morning. Is that correct?" Tyler's attorney, a man named Robert Fitzgerald, stood to respond. "Yes, Your Honor. My client maintains that the allegations against him are grossly exaggerated and that the protective order is preventing him from exercising his parental rights. And yet," Judge Chen said, consulting her notes, "the medical evidence is quite clear. The infant in question sustained injuries consistent with being struck by an adult hand with significant force." "Your Honor," Fitzgerald replied smoothly, "my client admits to using minimal physical correction to stop his son's crying. This is well within the bounds of reasonable parental discipline." Judge Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Fitzgerald, are you seriously arguing that striking a 6-month-old infant constitutes reasonable discipline?" "I'm arguing that parents have the right to establish boundaries and expectations for their children, even very young children." Judge Chen turned her attention to Tyler directly. "Mr. Bradford, in your own words, can you describe what happened Monday night?" Tyler stood, straightening his tie with the confidence of a man who believed his charm could overcome any obstacle. "Your Honor, my son was crying inconsolably. I'd been working long hours, my wife had been struggling with what I believed to be postpartum issues, and the stress in our household had been building for weeks. When Lucas wouldn't stop crying despite my attempts to comfort him, I used a light tap to redirect his attention." "A light tap," Judge Chen repeated flatly. "Yes, ma'am. Just enough to break the crying cycle and help him self-regulate." "Mr. Bradford, have you reviewed the medical photographs of your son's injuries?" Tyler's confidence flickered slightly. "I have, Your Honor, and I believe they make the contact look more severe than it actually was." Judge Chen picked up a tablet from her desk and swiped through several images. "Mr. Bradford, these photographs show a clear handprint across your infant son's face, including significant swelling around his left eye." The attending physician noted that the force required to create these injuries could have caused serious damage to the child's developing skull and brain. For the first time since I'd known him, Tyler looked genuinely rattled. "Your Honor, I certainly never intended to cause any serious harm. Intention is irrelevant when discussing child safety, Mr. Bradford. What matters is the actual harm caused and the likelihood of future harm." Commander Park stood to present our case, methodically walking through the medical evidence, the recorded phone conversation, and Tyler's own admissions about using physical force against Lucas. He was thorough but respectful, letting the facts speak for themselves rather than relying on emotional appeals. When it came time for me to testify, Victoria sat in the gallery behind me, her presence a steadying force as I described that horrible night. I kept my voice calm and factual, describing what I'd seen and heard without editorializing or trying to characterize Tyler's motivations. "Mrs. Bradford," Judge Chen asked, "prior to Monday night, had you observed any behavior from your husband that caused you concern regarding his interactions with your son?" I thought carefully before answering. "Yes, Your Honor. Over the past few months, Tyler had become increasingly frustrated with normal infant behavior. He would make comments about Lucas being manipulative or attention-seeking, and he seemed to view crying as defiance rather than communication. Did you ever fear for your son's safety before Monday night?" "Not consciously," I admitted, "but I realize now that I had started avoiding leaving Lucas alone with Tyler, especially when Lucas was fussy. I told myself it was because I was better at soothing him, but looking back, I think I was unconsciously protecting him." Judge Chen made several notes, then addressed both attorneys. "Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that the minor child, Lucas Bradford, is at substantial risk of harm if returned to the family home while Mr. Bradford has access. The emergency protective order will remain in place pending a full custody evaluation." Tyler's face went white. "Your Honor, you're talking about my son. I have rights as his father." "Mr. Bradford, your rights as a father do not include the right to physically assault your child. Until this court is satisfied that you do not pose a danger to Lucas, you will have supervised visitation only, and Mrs. Bradford will retain primary custody." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, and I felt something inside me that had been clenched tight for months finally begin to relax. Lucas was safe. At least for now, he was safe. As we left the courthouse, Tyler caught up with us in the parking lot. Victoria immediately positioned herself between him and me, her military bearing, making it clear that any aggressive moves would be met with immediate response. "Claire, this is insane," Tyler said, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're destroying our family over a misunderstanding. I love Lucas." "I would never hurt him." "You did hurt him," I said quietly. "You hit a baby, Tyler. Our baby." I was trying to help him learn to self-regulate. Babies need structure. They need to understand that crying isn't always the solution to their problems. Victoria stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Bradford, I'm going to give you some free advice. Stop talking. Every word out of your mouth is making your legal situation worse." Tyler's eyes flashed with anger as he looked at my sister. "This is all your fault, isn't it? You've been poisoning Claire against me since the beginning. Military families think they're better than everyone else, but you're just a bunch of control freaks in uniforms." "Mr. Bradford," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had commanded respect from subordinates for 2 decades. "You just threatened a United States Navy admiral in front of witnesses. I strongly suggest you walk away before you add federal charges to your growing list of legal problems." Tyler opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to realize how precarious his position had become. He looked at me one more time, his expression cycling between rage and something that might have been genuine confusion. "This isn't over, Claire," he said finally. "I'm Lucas's father. That means something." "Yes," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "It means you had a responsibility to protect him, and you failed." Tyler turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid with fury. Victoria and I stood in the parking lot watching him go, both of us understanding that the worst was yet to come. Men like Tyler didn't accept defeat gracefully, and a public humiliation in family court would only make him more dangerous. "He'll escalate," Victoria said matter-of-factly. "Probably within the next 48 hours. We need to be ready." That evening, back in our temporary apartment on base, I fed Lucas his dinner while Victoria worked on her laptop. The routine felt almost normal, if you ignored the fact that we were essentially in hiding from my own husband. Lucas seemed happier than he'd been in weeks, more responsive and playful, as if he could sense that the constant tension had lifted from our lives. "Victoria," I said as I was getting Lucas ready for bed, "what happens if Tyler fights this custody arrangement long-term? What if he appeals or hires better lawyers, or finds some way to get visitation rights back. Victoria looked up from her computer, her expression thoughtful. That's actually what I'm hoping he'll do. What do you mean? Right now, Tyler's been charged with child abuse, but it's a relatively minor charge. If he accepts the custody arrangement and complies with court orders, he'll probably get probation and mandatory anger management classes. He might even eventually get some visitation rights back. But if he escalates, if he violates the protective order or makes threats or tries to circumvent the legal system, then he graduates to more serious charges: stalking, harassment, contempt of court, violation of federal protective orders. That's when we can put him away for real. I stared at my sister, beginning to understand the complexity of what she was orchestrating. You want him to escalate. I want him to show everyone exactly who he really is, Victoria corrected. Right now, some people might still think this was just a stressed-out new father who made a terrible mistake. But men like Tyler can't help themselves. Give them enough rope, and they'll hang themselves. And if he doesn't escalate, if he just accepts the custody arrangement and moves on, Victoria's smile was sharp and predatory. Then Lucas grows up safe from his father, and you get to rebuild your life in peace. Either way, we win. As I tucked Lucas into his crib that night, I marveled at how much my life had changed in just 4 days. A week ago, I'd been a suburban housewife trying to make my marriage work, and wondering why I felt so anxious all the time. Now I was a single mother living on a military base, protected by armed guards and legal documents that could send my husband to prison. The transformation should have felt more traumatic, but instead it felt like waking up from a long, confusing dream. For the first time in months, I could make decisions about Lucas's care without second-guessing myself or worrying about Tyler's criticism. I could respond to my baby's needs without calculating whether my actions would trigger my husband's irritation. Freedom, I realized, wasn't just the absence of physical danger. It was the absence of fear itself, the ability to exist without constantly monitoring someone else's mood and adjusting your behavior accordingly. Tyler had taken that freedom from me so gradually that I hadn't even noticed it was gone until it was suddenly returned. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. You can't hide forever. Lucas needs his father. I showed the message to Victoria, who immediately began taking screenshots and adding it to what she called our evidence file. Right on schedule, she said grimly. He made it almost 6 hours before violating the no-contact order. Should I be scared? I asked. Victoria looked up from her documentation, her expression serious but not alarmed. You should be careful. But scared? No. Tyler doesn't realize it yet, but every move he makes now is being watched and recorded. He's not the predator anymore, Claire. He's the prey. The escalation began exactly 36 hours after the custody hearing, just as Victoria had predicted. I was giving Lucas his morning bottle when my phone started ringing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The first few went to voicemail, but when the 5th call came in 15 minutes, I answered. Claire, it's Janet from the school. Janet Morrison was the secretary at Bayshore Elementary, where I'd taught before Lucas was born. Her voice sounded strained, worried. Tyler's been here asking questions about you. He wanted to know if we had a forwarding address, if you'd mentioned where you were staying. Principal Davidson told him we couldn't share personnel information, but he got pretty aggressive about it. My blood ran cold. Tyler was hunting for us, systematically contacting anyone who might know our location. What kind of questions was he asking? He said you'd had some kind of mental health crisis after the baby was born, that you'd taken Lucas and disappeared without telling him where you were going. He made it sound like you were having a breakdown, and he was just a worried husband trying to get help for his family. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety Tyler had always been able to create with his carefully constructed narratives. Even now, even after everything, he was still trying to control the story, make himself the victim, and me the unstable one. Janet, Tyler hit our baby. There's a protective order in place. If he comes back to the school, you need to call the police immediately. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Janet spoke again, her voice much smaller than before. "Oh my God, Claire, I'm so sorry, I had no idea. It's not your fault. Tyler's very good at making people believe what he wants them to believe. Just please, if he contacts the school again, don't give him any information and call the police right away." After I hung up, I found Victoria in her makeshift office, surrounded by printed emails and legal documents. She looked up when I entered, immediately reading the concern on my face. "Tyler's making rounds," I told her, explaining about the call from Janet. "He's going to everyone who might know where we are." Victoria nodded grimly, making notes on a legal pad. "That's harassment and violation of the protective order. Each contact he makes with people connected to you is a separate charge." She picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory. "Commander Park? It's Admiral Morrison. We need to file additional charges against Bradford. He's actively hunting for my sister's location." While Victoria handled the legal implications, I tried to process what Tyler's behavior meant for our safety. He wasn't just angry about losing custody, he was conducting what felt like a systematic search operation. The man I'd married, the charming defense contractor who brought me flowers and cooked dinner when I was tired, had transformed into someone I barely recognized. The second call came from my former neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who'd lived next to our house in Bayshore Heights for 30 years. Her voice was shaky when I answered. "Claire, dear, I'm sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know. Tyler came by this morning asking if I'd seen you and the baby. He said you'd been having some troubles and he was worried about you. What did you tell him?" I asked, though I was fairly certain Mrs. Patterson wouldn't have had any useful information to share. "Well, I told him I hadn't seen you since before the baby was born." But Claire, he didn't seem satisfied with that answer. He kept pressing, asking if I'd noticed any cars in your driveway, if I'd seen you packing bags, if anyone had been helping you move things. The image of Tyler interrogating my elderly neighbor made my stomach turn. Mrs. Patterson was in her 70s, living alone and probably intimidated by a large, angry man demanding information she didn't have. "I'm sorry he bothered you, Mrs. Patterson. Tyler and I are separated right now, and there are some legal issues we're working through. If he comes back, please don't feel obligated to answer his questions. You can just tell him to contact my lawyer. Oh dear, I hope everything works out for you and that sweet baby." Tyler seemed so upset, but there was something about the way he was asking questions that didn't sit right with me. Almost like he was interrogating me, instead of just asking for help. Mrs. Patterson's instincts were sharper than Tyler had probably expected. Even at 75, she'd recognized something predatory in his behavior, something that went beyond normal concern for a missing wife and child. The third call came from my former pediatrician's office. Tyler had apparently called claiming to be updating emergency contact information for Lucas, trying to get them to confirm which practice we'd transferred to. The receptionist, following standard privacy protocols, had refused to provide any information, but Tyler had become increasingly agitated during the conversation. He kept insisting that he was the father and had a right to know where his son was receiving medical care, the receptionist told me. When I explained that we couldn't share that information without written authorization, he started yelling about patient rights and threatening to file complaints with our licensing board. By noon, Victoria had documented 7 separate contacts Tyler had made with people and institutions connected to me. Each contact represented a violation of the protective order, and together they painted a picture of a man becoming increasingly desperate and unstable. "This is actually perfect," Victoria said, reviewing the growing list of violations. "Tyler's building our case for us faster than we ever could have on our own." "Perfect for the legal case, maybe," I replied, bouncing Lucas on my hip as he fussed through what should have been his nap time. "But what about our actual safety? If he's this determined to find us, what happens when he realizes we're on base? What if he tries to force his way through security?" Victoria's expression grew serious. "Tyler's a defense contractor with an active security clearance. He knows better than to try anything stupid on a military installation. But you're right to be concerned about escalation. Men like Tyler don't handle losing control well, and public humiliation makes them dangerous." She turned back to her laptop and pulled up what looked like a surveillance report. I've had base security monitoring Tyler's movements since Tuesday. He's been driving past the main gate every few hours, probably trying to figure out if we're here. He's also been parked outside the family court building, the CPS office, and your old school. Classic stalking behavior. The idea that Tyler was systematically surveilling locations connected to our case made my skin crawl. This wasn't the behavior of a concerned father trying to reunite with his family. This was the behavior of a predator tracking his prey. Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. My sister looked up from her computer, giving me her full attention. How dangerous is Tyler, really? I mean, beyond what he's already done to Lucas. Are we talking about someone who might escalate to serious violence? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer carefully. Claire, I've spent 22 years in the military. I've seen men under extreme stress. Men who've lost everything they thought they could count on. Tyler fits the profile of someone who could become genuinely dangerous if he feels cornered enough. What kind of dangerous? The kind who starts thinking that if he can't have his family, then no one can. The words hung in the air between us, stark and terrifying. I looked down at Lucas, who had finally fallen asleep in my arms, his face still showing the fading bruise from his father's violence. The idea that Tyler might escalate from hitting our baby to something even worse felt both unthinkable and increasingly possible. But, Victoria continued, that's exactly why we're being so methodical about this. Every violation Tyler commits, every threat he makes, every boundary he crosses, gets documented and added to the evidence file. When he finally does something that crosses the line into serious criminal behavior, we'll have a paper trail that ensures he gets the maximum possible consequences. You sound like you're expecting him to cross that line. I am, Victoria said simply. Men like Tyler always do. The only question is how far he'll go before he gets stopped. That afternoon, while Lucas napped, I found myself standing at the window of our temporary apartment, watching military aircraft practice touch-and-go landings on the base runway. The sight was oddly comforting, a reminder that we were surrounded by people trained to handle dangerous situations. But it also underscored how completely my life had changed in less than a week. A month ago, I'd been worried about normal things like whether Lucas was eating enough and when I should go back to work. Now I was living behind military security barriers, afraid of my own husband. My phone rang again, interrupting my thoughts. This time, it was a number I recognized. Tyler's mother, Patricia Bradford, calling from her home in Jacksonville. I hesitated before answering, unsure whether speaking to her would help or hurt our situation. Hello, Patricia. Claire, sweetheart, I just heard about what's been happening with you and Tyler. Her voice carried the same warm maternal tone she'd always used with me, but there was something underneath it that I couldn't quite identify. I'm so worried about you and little Lucas. We're safe, I said carefully, not wanting to provide any information that might find its way back to Tyler. I'm sure you are, dear, but I can't help thinking there might be some misunderstanding here. Tyler loves that baby so much, and he's absolutely devastated about being separated from him. Is there any chance you and Tyler could sit down and work this out like adults? The suggestion felt like a slap. Work it out like adults. As if Tyler hitting our baby was some kind of marital disagreement that could be resolved through communication and compromise. Patricia, Tyler hit Lucas. Hard enough to leave bruises, there's nothing to work out. Oh, honey, I know Tyler told me about that. He feels terrible about it, just terrible. But you know how men are with babies. They don't have the same natural instincts we do. Sometimes they use a firmer hand than they should. But it doesn't mean they don't love their children. I felt my jaw clench as Patricia continued making excuses for her son's violence. This was where Tyler had learned to rationalize abuse, to minimize it as normal masculine behavior instead of criminal assault on a helpless infant. Patricia, hitting a 6-month-old baby is never acceptable. There's no excuse for it, no explanation that makes it okay. Well, of course not, dear. I'm not saying it was right. I'm just saying that maybe Tyler could benefit from some parenting classes, some guidance on how to handle a fussy baby. You don't need to destroy your marriage over something that can be fixed with a little help. Destroy your marriage. The phrase echoed in my head, carrying the implication that I was the one causing problems by refusing to accept Tyler's violence. This was the same narrative Tyler had been spreading, the story that painted him as a struggling father in need of support rather than a man who'd chosen to hit a baby. Patricia, I need you to understand something. This isn't about saving or destroying a marriage. This is about protecting Lucas from someone who hurt him. But Tyler would never seriously hurt Lucas, Patricia protested. He loves that boy more than anything in the world. He already did seriously hurt Lucas. And if I hadn't removed Lucas from that situation, Tyler would have hurt him again. The conversation ended with Patricia expressing disappointment in my unwillingness to forgive, and a suggestion that I might be suffering from postpartum depression that was affecting my judgment. By the time I hung up, I felt drained and angry, frustrated by the web of enablement that had probably surrounded Tyler his entire life. Victoria found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at my phone with what must have been a shell-shocked expression. "Let me guess," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Tyler's family thinks you're overreacting. His mother wants us to work it out like adults. She thinks Tyler just needs some parenting classes." Victoria snorted. "Of course she does. I guarantee you Tyler learned how to manipulate and minimize consequences from watching his parents. No one becomes that skilled at emotional manipulation without years of practice." She made me feel like I was the one being unreasonable, like protecting Lucas from his father was somehow cruel and vindictive. "That's exactly what she was trying to do," Victoria said. "These families operate like cults. They have their own version of reality, where abuse gets reframed as discipline, where victims are responsible for the violence against them, where anyone who challenges the system becomes the real problem." I thought about the early days of my relationship with Tyler, how charming and normal his family had seemed during holiday visits. Patricia had been warm and welcoming, always interested in my work and my plans with Tyler. I'd interpreted her protectiveness of her son as normal maternal love, never recognizing it as a systematic defense of his right to behave however he wanted without consequences. "Victoria, how did I miss all of this? How did I not see that Tyler came from a family that would excuse anything he did? Because they didn't want you to see it," Victoria replied. "Think about it, Claire. How often did you spend extended time with Tyler's family before you got married? How often did you see them interact when they thought no outsiders were watching?" I considered the question. Most of my contact with Tyler's family had been during brief holiday visits or structured social events. I'd never lived near them, never spent enough time observing their daily dynamics to recognize the patterns of enablement and excuse-making. "They showed you exactly what they wanted you to see," Victoria continued. "A loving, supportive family with normal relationships. They saved the dysfunction for private moments, just like Tyler saved his anger for times when you couldn't escape or get help." The realization was both validating and terrifying. If Tyler's family was committed to protecting him from consequences, they might be willing to help him violate the protective order or circumvent the legal system. Patricia's phone call hadn't been a genuine attempt at reconciliation. It had been reconnaissance, an attempt to gauge my willingness to drop charges and return to the status quo. That evening, as I was feeding Lucas his dinner, Victoria received a call that made her face go dark with concern. She stepped into the bedroom to take it privately, but I could hear the sharp, professional tone she used when dealing with serious military business. When she emerged 20 minutes later, her expression was grim. "That was base security," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Tyler's been arrested." My heart jumped. For what? He tried to force his way through the main gate an hour ago, claimed he had business on base, became belligerent when the guards asked for his authorization, and then made threats about what would happen if they didn't let him see his family. I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief that Tyler had finally crossed a line that would result in serious consequences, but dread about what his arrest might mean for our long-term safety. "What kind of threats?" I asked. Victoria consulted her notes from the phone call. He told the gate guards that he knew his wife and child were being held on base against their will, and that he had a right to see them regardless of any paperwork bullshit from family court. When they explained that he needed proper authorization to enter the base, he started yelling about constitutional rights and threatened to call his congressman. That doesn't sound like grounds for arrest. It wasn't. But then he tried to ram the security barrier with his car. The words hit me like a physical blow. Tyler had actually tried to force his way onto a military base, using his vehicle as a weapon. The man I'd married, the father of my child, had escalated to the point of using potentially deadly force against military personnel. "Is anyone hurt?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No. The barriers are designed to stop vehicles much larger than Tyler's sedan. But attempting to breach military security is a federal crime. He's looking at charges for trespassing on federal property, attempted assault with a vehicle, and violation of the protective order. Victoria pulled up another document on her laptop. But here's the interesting part. When they searched his car after the arrest, they found a handgun in the glove compartment. Tyler has a concealed carry permit, so the gun itself isn't illegal. But bringing a weapon to a military installation while attempting to breach security is a separate federal offense. I stared at my sister, trying to process the information. Tyler had come to the base armed. Whatever his intentions had been, he'd prepared for the possibility of using lethal force to get to Lucas and me. Victoria, what if he'd succeeded? What if he'd actually made it through the gate? He wouldn't have, Victoria said firmly. Military bases have multiple layers of security specifically designed to stop exactly this kind of intrusion. But the fact that he tried tells us everything we need to know about Tyler's state of mind. She turned her laptop toward me, showing me a booking photo that had been taken at the Escambia County Jail. Tyler looked disheveled and wild-eyed, his usually perfect hair messed and his expression carrying a rage I'd never seen before. This wasn't the composed, charming man I'd married. This was someone who'd lost all pretense of rationality. "Claire, I need you to understand how serious this situation has become," Victoria said, her voice carrying the weight of military authority. "Tyler didn't just violate a protective order today. He committed multiple federal crimes in an attempt to reach you and Lucas. The man we're dealing with now is not the same person you married. He's become genuinely dangerous. What happens next? Tyler will be held pending a federal arraignment. Given the serious nature of the charges and his demonstrated willingness to use violence, I doubt he'll be granted bail. But even if he is, there will be additional restrictions and monitoring." Victoria closed her laptop and looked at me seriously. "But we also need to start thinking about long-term safety planning. Tyler's family knows he's been arrested by now. They might decide to take action on his behalf, either to help him make bail or to pressure you into dropping charges." As if summoned by her words, my phone rang. Patricia Bradford's name appeared on the screen, calling for the second time that day. I showed the screen to Victoria, who nodded for me to answer. "Hello, Patricia." "Claire, this is insane." Patricia's voice was no longer warm and maternal. It was sharp, accusatory, and barely controlled. "Tyler's been arrested for trying to see his own son. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" "Patricia, Tyler tried to force his way onto a military base with a loaded gun. That's not trying to see his son. That's committing federal crimes." "He was desperate. You've been keeping his child away from him for a week. What did you expect him to do?" The question was revealing. In Patricia's mind, Tyler's increasingly violent behavior was a natural and justified response to being denied access to Lucas. She couldn't or wouldn't see that his actions proved exactly why the protective order had been necessary in the first place. "I expected him to follow the court orders and work through the legal system like every other parent in a custody dispute," I said. "The legal system you manipulated with your military connections," Patricia snapped. "Don't think we don't know what's really going on here. Your sister pulled strings to get Tyler arrested, and now you're trying to destroy his life because you couldn't handle being a mother." Victoria gestured for me to put the call on speaker, then began taking notes as Patricia continued her tirade. "Tyler is a good father and a good husband, and you've turned him into a criminal because you couldn't deal with normal parenting stress. That poor boy needs his daddy, and you're keeping them apart out of spite." "Patricia, Tyler hit Lucas hard enough to leave bruises on his face. There's nothing normal about that. Children need discipline. Maybe if more parents were willing to set boundaries instead of coddling their children, we wouldn't have a generation of entitled brats who think the world owes them something." The conversation was being recorded, and Patricia was providing evidence of the family attitudes that had shaped Tyler's beliefs about acceptable treatment of children. Her defense of child abuse as necessary discipline was exactly the kind of testimony that would help prosecutors establish a pattern of learned behavior. "I need to go, Patricia," I said, no longer willing to listen to justifications for violence against my son. "This isn't over, Claire. Tyler has rights as a father, and we're going to fight for them. We know lawyers too, and we know how to expose people who abuse the system to get what they want." The call ended with what sounded distinctly like a threat, and Victoria immediately began documenting the conversation as part of our evidence file. "She's going to try to help him," I said, feeling a new layer of anxiety settle over me. "Tyler's family is going to do whatever they can to get him out of jail and back into Lucas's life." "Let them try," Victoria said grimly. "Every move they make to help Tyler circumvent the legal system just adds to the evidence that this entire family sees nothing wrong with his behavior. The more they reveal about their attitudes toward child abuse, the stronger our case becomes." That night, as I put Lucas to bed in our temporary apartment, I tried to imagine what our future might look like. Tyler was in federal custody, facing charges that could result in years in prison. His family was mobilizing to defend him, which meant they would likely become increasingly hostile toward me. The life I'd built in Pensacola was completely shattered, and I had no idea where Lucas and I would end up when this was all over. But as I watched my son sleep peacefully, his face finally free of bruises, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. For the first time since Tyler had hit Lucas, I could envision a future where my son would grow up safe, where he would never again have to fear his father's anger, where he would learn that love didn't come with violence attached. Victoria knocked softly on the bedroom door and entered carrying 2 cups of tea. She handed me one and settled into the chair beside Lucas's crib. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. "I keep thinking I should feel worse about this," I admitted. "Tyler's in jail. His career is probably over. His family hates me, and I'm homeless with a baby. But mostly, I just feel relieved." Victoria nodded. "That's not callousness, Claire. That's your survival instincts finally being allowed to function properly. For months you've been suppressing your natural protective responses because Tyler convinced you they were overreactions. I keep wondering what would have happened if he hadn't hit Lucas. If he'd just continued the emotional manipulation and control without escalating to physical violence. Would I ever have recognized what he was? Maybe not," Victoria said honestly. "But he did escalate. Because men like Tyler always do. They can't help themselves. The need to control, to dominate, eventually overrides their ability to maintain the facade." I sipped my tea and watched Lucas's tiny chest rise and fall with each breath. "Victoria, what if I make this same mistake again? What if I'm just not good at recognizing dangerous people?" "Then you'll learn," Victoria said simply. "But Claire, you did recognize it when it mattered most. When Lucas was in danger, you didn't hesitate to protect him. You didn't make excuses for Tyler or try to minimize what he'd done. You got your son to safety, and you called for help. That's exactly what a good mother does." Outside our window, I could hear the sounds of the military base settling into evening routines. Guards changing shifts, aircraft being secured for the night, the distant hum of equipment and machinery that never completely stopped. It was a world I'd never imagined being part of, but it had become our sanctuary when we needed it most. "Victoria, I need to ask you something else. Anything. When all this is over, when Tyler's been sentenced and the legal battles are finished, what happens to us? Where do Lucas and I go?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Wherever you want to go. You have options now, Claire. Tyler's arrest means he won't be able to fight you for custody or use financial manipulation to control where you live. You're free to rebuild your life however you want." The word freedom had never sounded so appealing or so terrifying. For 3 years, my choices had been shaped by Tyler's preferences, Tyler's career, Tyler's vision of what our family should look like. Now, for the first time since I'd married him, I could make decisions based solely on what was best for Lucas and me. "I think," I said slowly, "I'd like to stay somewhere near the ocean. Lucas loves watching the seagulls from the base beach, and I want him to grow up somewhere peaceful." Victoria smiled. The ocean sounds perfect. And Claire? Whatever you decide, wherever you want to go, you won't be alone. You've got family who will always have your back. As I settled into bed that night, I thought about the conversation with Tyler's mother and her insistence that I was destroying their family. But families built on enabling abuse and making excuses for violence were already destroyed. I hadn't broken anything that hadn't been broken from the beginning. I'd just finally stopped pretending it was whole. The federal courthouse in Pensacola felt like entering a fortress, all marble columns and metal detectors and stern-faced marshals who looked like they'd seen every variation of human desperation. Victoria walked beside me through the security checkpoint, her dress uniform drawing respectful nods from court personnel who recognized the rank insignia of a Navy admiral. Lucas dozed against my shoulder, blissfully unaware that his father's fate was about to be decided in the imposing building around us. Tyler's arraignment was scheduled for 9 a.m., but we'd arrived early to meet with the federal prosecutor assigned to the case. Assistant United States Attorney Maria Santos was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of confidence that comes from winning more cases than you lose. She greeted Victoria with the mutual respect of two professionals who understood the gravity of their respective responsibilities. "Admiral Morrison, Mrs. Bradford," she said, shaking our hands in turn. "I've reviewed the evidence in this case, and I want you to know that we're taking Mr. Bradford's actions very seriously." She led us to a small conference room where case files were spread across a table like battle plans. Tyler's criminal history, his security clearance documentation, witness statements from base security, medical records from Lucas's hospital visit, and recordings of his increasingly threatening phone calls to people in my life. The attempted breach of a federal military installation is serious enough on its own, Prosecutor Santos explained. But when combined with the weapon possession and the underlying domestic violence case, we're looking at a pattern of escalating dangerous behavior. Victoria leaned forward slightly. "What kind of sentence are we looking at if he's convicted on all charges?" "Federal trespassing with intent to harm, attempted assault with a vehicle, weapons violations on federal property, and violation of protective orders. If convicted on all counts, Mr. Bradford could face 10 to 15 years in federal prison." 10 to 15 years. The numbers felt surreal, too large to comprehend. A week ago, Tyler had been my husband, the father of my child, someone I'd planned to spend my life with. Now prosecutors were discussing the possibility of him spending more than a decade behind bars. "There's something else you should know," Prosecutor Santos continued, consulting her notes. "Mr. Bradford's employer has already revoked his security clearance and terminated his employment. Defense contractors can't afford to have employees with pending federal charges, especially those involving weapons and violence." Victoria's expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight satisfaction in her eyes. Tyler's systematic campaign to find and intimidate me had cost him not just his freedom but his career and financial security. Every choice he'd made since losing custody of Lucas had only made his situation worse. "What about his family?" I asked. "His mother has been calling me, making threats about exposing what she calls abuse of the system." Prosecutor Santos made a note. "Any threats or harassment from Mr. Bradford's associates or family members should be reported immediately. Witness intimidation is a serious federal crime, and we have zero tolerance for attempts to influence testimony or evidence." The arraignment itself felt like watching a stranger undergo judgment. Tyler appeared via video link from the Federal Detention Center, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look diminished somehow, smaller than the commanding presence I'd once found so attractive. His hair was uncombed, his usual confident posture replaced by the slumped shoulders of someone realizing the full scope of his legal troubles. Judge Robert Walsh presided over the hearing with the efficient authority of someone who'd seen countless criminals attempt to justify their actions. Tyler's court-appointed attorney, a young man who looked overwhelmed by the complexity of federal charges, attempted to argue for bail based on Tyler's lack of prior criminal history and his ties to the community. "Your Honor," the defense attorney said, "my client is a respected member of the community with no previous arrests. He has strong family support and significant ties to the area." The alleged offenses were committed during a period of extreme emotional distress following separation from his infant son. Judge Walsh reviewed Tyler's file with the kind of methodical attention that suggested he'd already made his decision. Mr. Bradford, you're charged with multiple federal offenses stemming from an attempt to breach military security while armed. The court notes that these charges came after you were already subject to a protective order for domestic violence against an infant. Tyler leaned toward his microphone, and for a moment his voice carried the same persuasive tone he'd always used when trying to convince me of something. Your Honor, I was desperate to see my son. I made poor choices, but I was just trying to be a father to my child. Mr. Bradford, Judge Walsh replied, his voice carrying no sympathy whatsoever, fathers don't typically attempt armed breaches of military installations to access their children. The behavior you've exhibited suggests a complete disregard for legal authority and public safety. The judge denied bail, citing Tyler as a flight risk and a danger to the community. Tyler's face went white as the implications sank in. He would remain in federal custody until trial, which could be months away. His carefully constructed life had collapsed entirely in the span of 2 weeks. After the hearing, Prosecutor Santos walked with us toward the courthouse exit. Mrs. Bradford, I want you to understand that your testimony will be crucial if this case goes to trial. Tyler's defense team will likely try to portray him as a devoted father, driven to desperation by an unfair legal system. What kind of questions will they ask me? I asked, already dreading the prospect of facing Tyler's attorney in open court. They'll try to establish that you overreacted to normal parental discipline, that you used your sister's military connections to manipulate the custody process, and that Tyler's subsequent actions were the result of psychological distress rather than criminal intent. Victoria's jaw tightened. In other words, they'll try to blame Claire for Tyler's choice to commit federal crimes. Exactly. Which is why our preparation will focus on demonstrating the pattern of Tyler's behavior, not just the single incident that triggered the protective order. Every threatening phone call, every violation of court orders, every act of intimidation helps establish that we're dealing with someone who believes he's above the law. That afternoon, back at our temporary housing on base, I tried to process what the morning had revealed. Tyler was facing potentially decades in prison, his career was destroyed, and his family was mobilizing to blame me for the consequences of his own actions. The man I'd once loved was becoming a stranger defined entirely by his anger and need for control. Victoria found me sitting on the small porch outside our apartment, watching training flights practice maneuvers over the Gulf of Mexico. She settled into the chair beside me, her uniform jacket folded neatly over her arm. "How are you feeling about the arraignment?" she asked. "Strange," I admitted. I keep expecting to feel sad about Tyler being in jail, about his life falling apart. But mostly, I just feel like I'm watching something happen to someone I used to know. That's healthy, Claire. The Tyler you married was probably always a carefully constructed performance, designed to get what he wanted. The man in that orange jumpsuit today is who he really is when the performance stops working. I thought about the early days of our relationship, how Tyler had seemed almost too good to be true. He'd anticipated my needs, remembered small details about my preferences, and made me feel like the center of his universe. At the time, I'd interpreted his attention as love. Now I wondered if it had been calculation. Victoria, when you first met Tyler, did you suspect he might be capable of something like this? My sister was quiet for a moment, watching a formation of training aircraft execute a complex turning maneuver over the water. I suspected he was performing rather than being genuine. He was too polished, too ready with exactly the right response to every situation. But capability for violence? No, I didn't see that coming. What did you see? Control. Everything about Tyler was designed to manage how other people perceived him. He told you exactly what you wanted to hear, presented himself as exactly what you were looking for in a partner. That level of calculated presentation usually means someone is hiding aspects of themselves they know wouldn't be acceptable. The observation stung because it was probably accurate. I'd been so eager to find someone who seemed perfect for me that I'd never questioned whether his perfection might be artificial. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Claire, this is Janet from Tyler's office. I heard about what happened. If you need a character witness for Tyler, I'd be happy to help. He's always been nothing but professional and kind to everyone here." I showed the message to Victoria, who immediately began taking screenshots. Tyler's colleagues don't know what he's really like either, she observed. He's probably been the perfect coworker the same way he was the perfect boyfriend. All performance, no authenticity. Should I respond to her? Any communication could be construed as soliciting support for Tyler or interfering with witness testimony. Let the prosecutors handle contact with his character witnesses. That evening, while preparing Lucas for bed, I received a call from Patricia Bradford. This time, her voice carried a sweetness that felt more threatening than her previous anger. "Claire, darling, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realize I may have come across as unsympathetic to your situation." I put the call on speaker so Victoria could hear, while continuing to dress Lucas in his pajamas. "I want you to know that the whole family understands you've been under tremendous stress since the baby was born. Postpartum depression is a serious condition, and it can make normal situations feel much more threatening than they actually are." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost questioned my own memories for a moment. Patricia was rewriting history in real time, transforming Tyler's violence into my mental health crisis. "Patricia, I'm not suffering from postpartum depression. I'm protecting my son from someone who hurt him." "Of course you are, sweetheart. But sometimes when we're not thinking clearly, our protective instincts can become exaggerated. What looks like abuse to someone in your condition might just be normal parenting to someone thinking more rationally." Victoria made a rolling gesture with her hand, encouraging me to keep Patricia talking while she recorded the conversation. "Have you considered seeking professional help?" Patricia continued. "There are excellent therapists who specialize in postpartum issues. I'd be happy to help you find someone qualified to evaluate your current mental state." The offer sounded generous on the surface, but the underlying message was clear. Patricia was trying to establish grounds for challenging my fitness as a mother, building a narrative that would support Tyler's eventual custody claims. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not interested in psychological evaluation." "Well, of course you're not, dear. People experiencing these kinds of episodes rarely recognize the need for help. That's why it's so important for family members to step in and advocate for what's best for everyone involved." "What exactly are you advocating for, Patricia?" "I'm advocating for my son to have access to his child and for that precious baby to have his father in his life. Tyler made a mistake, certainly, but destroying his entire future seems like such an extreme response to what was essentially a parenting error." A parenting error. Patricia had just reduced child abuse to a simple mistake, the kind of thing that could be corrected with better communication and understanding. Her ability to minimize Tyler's violence was both impressive and horrifying. "Patricia, Tyler didn't make a parenting error. He committed a violent crime against a baby." "That's your interpretation of events, sweetheart. But interpretation can be influenced by mental state. A more objective evaluation might reach very different conclusions." The conversation ended with Patricia expressing hope that I would seek the help I needed, and suggesting that family reconciliation was still possible if I was willing to be reasonable about Tyler's situation. Victoria immediately began transcribing key portions of the call, adding Patricia's comments to the growing file of evidence that demonstrated the family's complete lack of understanding about the seriousness of Tyler's actions. "She's building an alternative narrative," Victoria explained. "If they can establish that you're mentally unstable, they can argue that your version of events isn't reliable and that Tyler's actions were justified responses to your condition. Can they actually do that? Can they use claims about my mental health to get Tyler out of prison? They can try, but it won't work. The medical evidence from Lucas's injuries is objective, and Tyler's subsequent behavior has been witnessed by multiple law enforcement officers. No amount of gaslighting can change the physical evidence of what he did." The next morning brought news that shifted the entire dynamic of our case. Prosecutor Santos called to inform us that Tyler's defense team had approached the court with a plea bargain proposal. "Mr. Bradford is offering to plead guilty to the federal charges in exchange for a reduced sentence," she explained during our phone conference. "He's willing to accept 5 years in federal prison plus supervised probation in exchange for dropping the more serious charges." Victoria and I exchanged glances. 5 years was significant time, enough to ensure Lucas's safety during his most vulnerable early childhood years, but it also meant Tyler would eventually be released and potentially able to seek contact with our son. "What's your recommendation?" I asked. "Honestly, it's a reasonable offer," Prosecutor Santos admitted. "Federal trials are expensive and time-consuming, and there's always some risk of acquittal even with strong evidence. 5 years guaranteed is better than the possibility of Tyler walking free if a jury believes his defense team's narrative." "But?" Victoria prompted, clearly sensing hesitation in the prosecutor's voice. "But Tyler's behavior suggests he's not someone who accepts consequences gracefully. 5 years in prison might just give him time to plan more sophisticated forms of retaliation when he's released." The observation sent a chill through me. Tyler had escalated from emotional manipulation to child abuse to armed assault on a federal facility in the span of 2 weeks. What might he be capable of after years of imprisonment and resentment? "There's another consideration," Prosecutor Santos continued. "The plea bargain includes a provision requiring Tyler to surrender all parental rights to Lucas permanently. He would have no legal standing to seek custody or visitation when he's released." The permanent termination of Tyler's parental rights felt like the most important aspect of any deal. It would mean Lucas could grow up without the constant threat of his father returning to claim custody or influence his life. "What do you think, Victoria?" I asked. My sister was quiet for several moments, clearly weighing multiple factors in the way that military strategists approach complex decisions. "I think we take the deal," she said finally. 5 years is long enough to establish Lucas's life in a safe environment, and the termination of parental rights eliminates Tyler as a long-term threat to your family. And if Tyler violates the terms of his eventual probation, then he goes back to prison for the full remainder of his original sentence, Prosecutor Santos explained. "The plea agreement includes strict conditions about contact with you and Lucas. Any violation results in immediate revocation." Quote, "We agreed to accept the plea bargain, with the understanding that Tyler would be sentenced within 30 days and transferred to a federal correctional facility to begin serving his time immediately." The plea hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday, giving Tyler's family one final opportunity to mount a campaign aimed at changing my mind about accepting the deal. The pressure began almost immediately. Tyler's brother Michael called that afternoon, using the same manipulative tactics as his mother, but with a more aggressive edge to his voice. "Claire, I hope you understand what you're doing to Tyler's life," he said without preamble. 5 years in federal prison is going to destroy him. Are you really comfortable with that level of vindictiveness?" "I'm comfortable with protecting my son from someone who hurt him," I replied, no longer interested in engaging with the Bradford family's victim-blaming narratives. "Tyler made one mistake in a moment of frustration, and you're using it to destroy his entire existence. That doesn't seem proportional to what actually happened." What actually happened was that Tyler hit a baby hard enough to leave bruises, then violated multiple court orders trying to continue accessing his victim. The legal consequences are proportional to the crimes he committed. "Look, I get that you're angry, but think about Lucas. Don't you want him to know his father? Don't you want him to have that relationship when he gets older?" The question was designed to make me feel guilty for depriving Lucas of a paternal relationship, but it ignored the fundamental reality that Tyler had chosen violence over love when interacting with his son. "I want Lucas to grow up safe," I said simply. "Tyler demonstrated that he's not capable of providing safety. You're basing that judgment on one incident during a stressful period in his life. People can change, Claire. Tyler could get help, learn better parenting techniques, become the father Lucas deserves." "People can change," I agreed, "but they have to want to change." Tyler has never acknowledged that hitting Lucas was wrong. He's defended it as necessary discipline. That's not someone who's planning to change. The conversation ended with Michael expressing disappointment in my unwillingness to forgive, and a prediction that I would someday regret keeping Lucas from knowing his father. Similar calls came from Tyler's sister Rebecca, his cousin David, and several family friends who had apparently been recruited to pressure me into dropping charges or refusing the plea agreement. Each conversation followed the same pattern: minimizing Tyler's violence, questioning my motives, and suggesting that family reconciliation was more important than legal consequences. Victoria documented every call, every message, every attempt at manipulation by Tyler's support network. "They're building a record of harassment and witness intimidation," she explained. "If any of Tyler's family members cross the line into actual threats, we can file additional charges." The night before Tyler's plea hearing, I sat in our temporary apartment feeding Lucas his bedtime bottle and thinking about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. 2 weeks ago, I'd been a suburban mother trying to make my marriage work, despite growing unease about my husband's behavior. Now I was preparing to watch that husband accept a federal prison sentence while his family blamed me for destroying their lives. But Lucas was safe. The mark on his face had completely healed, and he was sleeping peacefully through the nights for the first time since he'd been born. Whatever trauma Tyler's violence had caused seemed to be fading as my son adjusted to an environment free from tension and fear. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Victoria asked, settling into the chair beside Lucas's crib. "I think so. It feels strange, watching someone I once loved accept responsibility for crimes I never imagined him capable of committing." "The Tyler you loved probably never existed," Victoria said gently. "What you loved was the performance he created to win your trust and access to your life. The real Tyler is the one who hits babies when they cry." Quote, her words were harsh, but probably accurate. I had been mourning the loss of someone who had never been real, grieving for a relationship that had been built on deception from the beginning. "Victoria, what happens after he's sentenced? Where do Lucas and I go from here?" "Wherever you want to go," she replied. "You're free now, Claire. Free to make choices based on what's best for you and Lucas, rather than what appeases someone else's anger. That's a gift not everyone gets." The federal courthouse felt different the morning of Tyler's plea hearing, less intimidating and more like a place where justice actually happened. Tyler appeared in person this time, flanked by his attorney and looking smaller somehow in his defendant's orange uniform. He glanced in my direction once, his expression unreadable, then focused his attention on Judge Walsh. The plea colloquy was methodical and thorough, with Judge Walsh ensuring that Tyler understood every aspect of the agreement he was accepting. 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, permanent termination of parental rights, and strict no-contact orders regarding Lucas and me. "Mr. Bradford," Judge Walsh said, "do you understand that by accepting this plea agreement you are permanently relinquishing all legal rights to your son?" Tyler hesitated for just a moment, and I saw something flicker across his face that might have been genuine grief. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand. And do you understand that any attempt to contact your former wife or son, directly or indirectly, will result in immediate revocation of this agreement and reimposition of the original charges?" "Yes, Your Honor. Do you wish to make any statement before I accept your plea?" Tyler stood slowly, and for a moment I thought he might apologize, might finally acknowledge the harm he'd caused and express genuine remorse for his actions. Instead, he said, "Your Honor, I love my son more than anything in the world. I hope someday he'll understand that everything I did was because I wanted to be his father." The statement was classic Tyler, framing his violence and criminal behavior as expressions of love rather than control. Even in defeat, even while accepting a prison sentence, he couldn't acknowledge that love doesn't include hitting babies or threatening military personnel. Judge Walsh accepted the plea without comment, sentenced Tyler to the agreed-upon terms, and ordered him remanded to federal custody for immediate transport to a correctional facility. Tyler was led away in shackles, disappearing into the federal prison system that would be his home for the next 5 years. As we left the courthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness exactly, but a profound sense of relief. The legal battle was over. Tyler's threats had been neutralized. Lucas and I were truly safe for the first time since he'd been born. "How does it feel?" Victoria asked as we walked toward her car. "Like I can finally breathe," I admitted. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I don't have to worry about Tyler's mood or Tyler's expectations or Tyler's anger. Lucas and I can just exist without walking on eggshells." Victoria nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. That's what freedom feels like, Claire. The absence of fear, the ability to make choices based on your own values rather than someone else's threats. That evening, as I was giving Lucas his bath, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another member of Tyler's family calling to express their anger about the plea agreement. But the voice on the other end was different, professional and official. "Mrs. Bradford, this is Warden Martinez from Federal Correctional Institution Coleman. I'm calling to inform you that Tyler Bradford has been processed into our facility and placed in general population. Per the conditions of his plea agreement, I wanted to confirm that you've been added to our no-contact registry. Mr. Bradford will not be able to call, write, or receive visits from you or your son." The call was brief and procedural, but it represented the final piece of Tyler's transformation from husband and father to federal prisoner. He was no longer Tyler Bradford, defense contractor and suburban father. He was now federal inmate number 47,829, serving a 5-year sentence for crimes against his own family. After hanging up, I sat holding Lucas and thinking about the enormous changes that had transformed our lives in less than 3 weeks. We'd gone from a troubled marriage to single motherhood, from suburban domesticity to military base housing, from victim to survivor. But mostly, we'd gone from afraid to free. And that, I realized, was worth everything we'd been through to get here. 6 months after Tyler's sentencing, I stood on the beach near our new home in Clearwater, watching Lucas take his first tentative steps in the sand. At 14 months old, he was fearless in the way only toddlers can be, stumbling toward the waves with the absolute confidence that someone would catch him if he fell. Victoria sat behind us in a beach chair, officially on vacation from her duties at Norfolk but actually serving as our self-appointed security coordinator during the transition to our new life. The house we'd found was a small cottage 3 blocks from the Gulf of Mexico, with a screened porch that overlooked a community garden and enough bedrooms for Lucas to have his own space as he grew older. It was nothing like the suburban palace Tyler had provided in Pensacola, but it felt like home in a way that house never had. There were no echoes of tension in these walls, no memories of walking on eggshells or monitoring someone else's mood for signs of approaching anger. "He's going to be walking everywhere by next month," Victoria observed, watching Lucas's determined attempts to chase a seagull that was clearly unimpressed by his efforts. "The pediatrician says his development is exactly on track," I replied, scooping Lucas up as he got too close to the water's edge. "Actually, she said he seems more socially engaged now than what's typical for his age, like he's making up for lost time." It was true. Lucas had transformed in the months since Tyler's imprisonment, becoming more playful, more curious, more willing to explore his environment without the constant vigilance that had characterized his earliest months. Children absorbed tension even when they were too young to understand its source, and removing that tension had allowed Lucas's natural personality to flourish. Victoria's phone buzzed with what looked like an official message. She read it quickly, then looked up with an expression I'd learned to recognize as her mission-accomplished face. "Tyler's been transferred to a medium security facility in North Carolina," she said. "Apparently he had some disciplinary issues at Coleman that resulted in additional restrictions being placed on his communications and movement." "What kind of disciplinary issues?" "According to my contact at the Bureau of Prisons, Tyler was caught attempting to use another inmate's phone privileges to make unauthorized calls. When confronted about it, he became belligerent with correctional officers and had to be placed in administrative segregation for several weeks. The information didn't surprise me. Tyler had never accepted limitations on his behavior gracefully, and prison would represent the ultimate challenge to his need for control. The idea that he was struggling to adapt to an environment where his charm and manipulation tactics held no power felt like poetic justice. Does the transfer affect the terms of his sentence? No, but it does add additional documentation to his prison record about non-compliance with institutional rules. If he ever comes up for early release consideration, behavior like this will count against him. I bounced Lucas on my hip as he babbled happily at the seagulls, trying to process how I felt about Tyler's continued struggles with authority. There was no satisfaction in his suffering, but there was a certain validation in knowing that his problems extended beyond our marriage. Tyler's issues weren't specific to me or to parenthood. They were fundamental character flaws that would cause him difficulties in any environment where he couldn't maintain absolute control. "Claire," Victoria said, her tone shifting to something more serious, "I need to tell you something else. Patricia Bradford has been attempting to contact the prison administration, claiming she has information about Tyler's mental health that might affect his sentencing." Quote, "My stomach tightened with familiar anxiety." Even from prison, Tyler's family was still trying to manipulate the system on his behalf, still refusing to accept that he was responsible for the consequences of his own actions. What kind of information? According to the warden's office, she's claiming that Tyler suffered some kind of psychological breakdown after Lucas's birth, that his actions were the result of untreated postpartum depression or similar condition that affected his judgment. The suggestion was both ridiculous and infuriating. Postpartum depression affected mothers who had carried and delivered babies, not fathers who decided that hitting infants was acceptable discipline. Patricia was grasping for any medical excuse that might reduce Tyler's culpability for choosing violence. Can she actually do anything with these claims? Quote, "Number? Tyler's already been sentenced under a plea agreement that he accepted voluntarily. The time for mental health defenses was before he pled guilty, not after he's already serving his sentence." Victoria set her phone aside and looked at me seriously. "But Claire, you should know that Patricia has also been making inquiries about your current location. She's been calling elementary schools in the Tampa Bay area, claiming to be updating emergency contact information for her grandson." The words sent a chill through me despite the warm Florida sunshine. Tyler's family was actively trying to locate us, probably with the intention of establishing some kind of relationship with Lucas that would undermine the no-contact provisions of Tyler's sentence. How close have they gotten to finding us? Not close at all. I've been monitoring their activities through various official channels, and they're basically fishing in the ocean with a small net. But it does indicate that they haven't accepted the finality of Tyler's situation. I looked down at Lucas, who was now contentedly playing with a handful of shells I'd given him to keep him occupied. The idea that Tyler's family might be planning some kind of contact with my son made my protective instincts flare in ways I hadn't experienced since the early days of our crisis. "Victoria, what can we do to make sure they never find us?" "We've already done most of it. Your legal name change was processed last month. Lucas's birth certificate has been updated to reflect Tyler's terminated parental rights, and all of your official records show addresses that are either outdated or deliberately misleading." The name change had been Victoria's idea, a way to ensure that Lucas and I could start completely fresh without any legal ties to the Bradford family. We were no longer Claire and Lucas Bradford. We were Claire and Lucas Morrison, carrying my sister's surname and the protection that came with her military connections. "But," Victoria continued, "there is one more step we could take if you're interested. Something that would make it virtually impossible for Tyler's family to locate you through normal channels." "What kind of step?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching Lucas attempt to stack shells into precarious towers that immediately collapsed in the sand. "I've been offered a new assignment. Deputy Commander of Naval Education and Training Command, based right here in Florida. It would mean I could stay in the area permanently, provide ongoing security oversight for you and Lucas." The offer was generous beyond anything I could have imagined. Victoria was sacrificing career advancement opportunities to serve as our long-term protector, using her military position to create an umbrella of security that would follow us wherever we went. "Victoria, you can't rearrange your entire career around protecting us. You've worked too hard to get where you are." "Claire, family is more important than rank. And besides, this isn't really a sacrifice. The position is actually a promotion, and it comes with resources and authority that could be very useful if Tyler's family decides to escalate their search efforts." I thought about what Victoria was offering. Permanent protection, ongoing security monitoring, and the peace of mind that came with knowing someone with significant official authority was always watching out for Lucas and me. It was tempting, but it also felt like accepting a life defined by fear of Tyler's family rather than freedom from their influence. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. "I think you should accept the reality that Tyler's family will never stop trying to insert themselves into Lucas's life. Patricia, Michael, Rebecca, all of them believe they have a right to access their grandson regardless of what Tyler did or what the courts decided. They're not going to respect boundaries or legal orders unless those boundaries are enforced by people with real power. The assessment was probably accurate. Tyler's family had demonstrated their willingness to blame me for Tyler's imprisonment, to minimize his violence, and to actively work against court-ordered protections. There was no reason to believe they would respect our wishes for privacy and safety. That evening, after putting Lucas to bed in his new room with its cheerful ocean-themed decorations and soft lighting, I sat on our screened porch listening to the distant sound of waves and thinking about the choices that had led me to this moment. A year ago, I'd been a married woman living in what I thought was a stable family situation. Now I was a single mother with a new identity, living under the protection of military security systems, and preparing for the possibility that my ex-husband's family might spend years trying to circumvent legal orders designed to protect my child. The transformation should have felt traumatic, but instead it felt like the most honest version of my life I'd ever experienced. For the first time since marrying Tyler, I was making decisions based entirely on what was best for Lucas and me, without having to consider how those decisions might affect someone else's ego or need for control. Victoria joined me on the porch, carrying 2 glasses of wine and settling into the chair beside mine. "Have you thought about what you want to do for work?" she asked. "The teaching jobs around here are competitive, but with your background and references, you'd probably have your pick of positions." I'd been considering the same question for weeks. Teaching had always been my passion, but returning to a traditional classroom felt like stepping backward instead of forward. The experience with Tyler had taught me something important about recognizing and responding to dangerous situations, skills that might be valuable in contexts beyond my own family. "Actually, I've been thinking about going back to school," I said. "There's a program at University of South Florida for family advocacy and child protection services. I could use what I've learned about domestic violence and legal systems to help other families navigate similar situations." Victoria nodded approvingly. "That makes sense. You understand the system from the inside now, and you know what it feels like to be overwhelmed by legal complexity while trying to protect a child. The program would take 2 years to complete, but it would prepare me for work with CPS, family courts, or domestic violence advocacy organizations. I could help other mothers recognize the warning signs I missed, help them document evidence, and navigate the legal process." "Lucas would be school age by the time you graduated," Victoria observed. "Perfect timing for you to start a new career while he's developing his own independence." The timeline felt right, like a natural progression from victim to survivor to advocate. Tyler's violence had nearly destroyed our family, but it had also taught me lessons about strength and resilience that could benefit other families facing similar crises. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. The caller ID showed a number from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which meant official business related to Tyler's incarceration. "Mrs. Morrison?" The voice belonged to someone from the Victim Services Department at Tyler's current facility. "I'm calling to inform you that Tyler Bradford has submitted a formal request to add your son Lucas to his approved correspondence list." The request felt like a violation, even though it had been denied. Tyler was testing the boundaries of his restrictions, looking for ways to circumvent the no-contact orders that were supposed to protect Lucas from his influence. "Obviously, the request was denied based on the court orders in his file," the caller continued, "but we're required to notify you of any attempts at contact per the victim notification protocols." After hanging up, I explained the call to Victoria, who immediately began making notes in what looked like an official incident report. "This establishes a pattern of continued attempts to contact Lucas despite court orders," she said. "If Tyler keeps testing boundaries, it could provide grounds for additional charges or extension of his sentence." "Do you think he'll keep trying?" "I think Tyler will keep pushing until he faces consequences severe enough to convince him that compliance is his only option. Right now, prison feels temporary to him. He's probably planning what he'll do when he gets out, including how he'll regain access to Lucas." The observation was troubling but realistic. Tyler had demonstrated his inability to accept limitations on his behavior throughout our marriage, and during his escalating criminal actions. 5 years in prison might not be enough time for him to develop genuine respect for legal boundaries. Over the next several weeks, the pattern continued. Tyler submitted requests to send birthday cards to Lucas, requests to receive photographs of his son, requests to have phone contact for emergency medical decisions, even though his parental rights had been legally terminated. Each request was denied, and each denial was followed by complaints to prison administration about, quote, unconstitutional restrictions on his parental rights. Prosecutor Santos called to discuss the escalating pattern of boundary testing. Tyler's behavior in prison suggests he hasn't accepted the finality of his situation, she explained. His continued attempts to contact Lucas could be grounds for charging him with violation of court orders, which would add time to his sentence. How much additional time are we talking about? Each violation could add 6 months to a year. If we can establish a pattern of deliberate non-compliance, we could be looking at several additional years added to his sentence. The possibility of extending Tyler's imprisonment felt both satisfying and exhausting. Part of me wanted him to face maximum consequences for his continued disrespect of court orders, but another part of me just wanted him to fade into irrelevance, so Lucas and I could move forward without constantly looking over our shoulders. What would you recommend? I asked. Document everything, but don't pursue additional charges unless Tyler's behavior escalates to actual contact or threats. As long as his violations remain unsuccessful attempts, the existing sentence provides adequate protection. That seemed reasonable. Tyler was already facing 5 years of imprisonment, followed by supervised probation. Adding more time wouldn't necessarily make Lucas and me any safer, and it would prolong our legal entanglement with someone we were trying to escape entirely. A year after Tyler's sentencing, I received notification that Patricia Bradford had died in a car accident near Jacksonville. The news came through Victoria's military contacts rather than any direct communication from Tyler's family, which meant they were still honoring the no-contact provisions even in the midst of their grief. How do you feel about it? Victoria asked after sharing the information. Sad for Tyler, I guess, I admitted. Patricia was manipulative and enabling, but she was still his mother. And I feel bad for Lucas, who will never have the chance to know his paternal grandmother, even in a limited capacity. Do you think her death will change Tyler's behavior? I considered the question carefully. Patricia had been Tyler's primary source of emotional support and validation, the person most committed to excusing his actions and minimizing his responsibilities. Her death might force him to confront reality in ways he'd never had to before. Maybe. Patricia was always there to tell Tyler that his problems were someone else's fault. Without that constant reinforcement, he might actually have to examine his own behavior. Quote, or, I realized, Patricia's death might make Tyler even more resentful and determined to blame me for depriving him of his final years with his mother. Grief could motivate people toward either growth or revenge, and Tyler's track record suggested revenge was more likely. The answer came 6 months later, when Tyler's behavior in prison shifted dramatically. Instead of continuing his pattern of boundary testing and complaints about his treatment, he enrolled in anger management classes, parenting courses, and what the prison called victim impact education programs. It could be genuine change, Victoria said when we discussed Tyler's apparent rehabilitation efforts, or it could be calculated preparation for early release applications. How can we tell the difference? Time. Genuine change requires sustained effort over years, not months. If Tyler maintains these programs throughout his sentence and demonstrates real understanding of the harm he caused, then maybe he's actually learning something. But if he drops out once he realizes they won't lead to early release, then we'll know it was performance. I hoped Tyler was genuinely changing, not for his sake but for Lucas's. My son was growing into a happy, confident toddler who would someday ask questions about his father. I wanted to be able to tell him that his father had learned from his mistakes, had become a better person because of the consequences he'd faced, had found ways to contribute positively to the world even from prison. But I also prepared for the possibility that Tyler's apparent rehabilitation was just another form of manipulation, another attempt to control the narrative and position himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the perpetrator of violence. On Lucas's second birthday, we had a small celebration on the beach near our cottage. Victoria had taken leave to be with us, and we'd invited a few neighbors who had become genuine friends rather than people we felt obligated to socialize with. Lucas toddled around in the sand, wearing a sun hat and tiny swim trunks, delighting in the attention and the chocolate cake that left him covered in frosting from head to toe. He's never going to remember Tyler, I realized as I watched my son play with the other children. By the time Tyler gets out of prison, Lucas will be 7 years old. Any relationship they might have would essentially be starting from scratch. Victoria nodded, understanding the implications, which means Lucas will be old enough to make his own decisions about whether he wants contact with his father. Tyler won't be able to rely on biological attachment or early childhood bonding to establish a relationship. The thought was both liberating and sobering. Lucas would grow up free from Tyler's influence, but he would also grow up with questions about his father that I would eventually need to answer honestly. I could protect my son from Tyler's violence, but I couldn't protect him from the psychological complexity of having a father who had chosen prison over family. As I tucked Lucas into bed that night, reading him the ocean-themed story that had become our bedtime routine, I thought about how far we'd traveled from that horrible night when Tyler had hit him. My son was safe, healthy, loved, and surrounded by people who would never see violence as an acceptable response to frustration. He was growing up in an environment where his needs were prioritized, where his emotions were validated, where his safety was never negotiable. Tyler had lost his son forever the moment he chose to raise his hand against a baby. But Lucas had gained something even more valuable: the knowledge that he was worth protecting, that love didn't include violence, and that there were people in the world who would move heaven and earth to keep him safe. Victoria knocked softly on the bedroom door and entered, carrying a folder that looked suspiciously official. "I have some news," she said, settling into the chair beside Lucas's crib. Tyler's early release application was denied. He'll serve his full 5-year sentence, and his supervised probation will include additional restrictions based on his behavior in prison. What kind of additional restrictions? No contact with minors without court supervision, mandatory psychological evaluation before any custody applications, and GPS monitoring for the first 2 years of his probation. The restrictions felt like validation of everything we'd endured to keep Lucas safe. Tyler's own behavior had convinced authorities that he remained a potential threat, that the original court orders had been necessary and appropriate. "There's something else," Victoria continued. "I've been offered the position I told you about, and I've decided to accept it. I'll be staying in Florida permanently." I felt a wave of relief so profound that I almost started crying. Victoria's presence had been the foundation of our safety throughout this entire ordeal, and knowing she would remain close felt like the final piece of security Lucas and I needed to build a truly stable life. "Thank you," I whispered, not trusting my voice to carry more than those 2 words. "Thank you for letting me be part of Lucas's life," Victoria replied. "Watching him grow up safe and happy is the best assignment I've ever had." 3 years later, Lucas started kindergarten at a school where no one knew our history, where my son was simply Lucas Morrison, a bright, energetic 5-year-old who loved sea creatures and building elaborate sandcastles on the beach. His teacher commented on his emotional intelligence, his ability to comfort classmates who were upset, his natural instinct to include children who seemed left out of group activities. "He has remarkable empathy for someone so young," she told me during our first parent conference. "It's like he understands that everyone needs to feel safe and included." I smiled, recognizing Lucas's protective instincts as something he'd inherited not from Tyler but from the family that had actually raised him. Victoria's fierce loyalty, my determination to prioritize his well-being, and the community of friends and neighbors who had embraced us as we built our new life. Tyler would be released from prison in 18 months, but he would return to a world where Lucas and I had completely disappeared from his sphere of influence. We had new names, new lives, new identities built around safety and stability rather than fear and control. Tyler's violence had destroyed the family he'd tried to dominate, but it had created space for Lucas to grow up surrounded by people who understood that love meant protection, not possession. The beach house where we'd made our home was filled with evidence of Lucas's happy childhood. Art projects from school covering the refrigerator, a collection of shells and sea glass he'd gathered during our daily walks, photographs of birthday parties and holiday celebrations with people who had chosen to be our family, rather than people we'd been assigned by biology or marriage. Victoria often joined us for dinner, sharing stories from her work and listening to Lucas's elaborate descriptions of his school day. She was the closest thing to a father figure my son had ever known, teaching him how to fish and throw a baseball and change a tire when he got older. More importantly, she modeled what healthy authority looked like: protection without control, guidance without manipulation, love without conditions. On quiet evenings, after Lucas was asleep and Victoria had returned to her own apartment on base, I would sit on our screened porch, listening to the ocean and marveling at the life we'd built from the ashes of my marriage. Tyler's violence had nearly destroyed us, but it had also revealed strength I'd never known I possessed, family bonds that couldn't be broken by distance or difficulty, and the fundamental truth that safety was worth any sacrifice necessary to achieve it. Lucas would ask about his father someday, and I would tell him the truth in age-appropriate ways, that his father had made very serious mistakes, that those mistakes had consequences, and that keeping Lucas safe had required difficult but necessary choices. I would explain that families come in many forms, that love means different things to different people, and that the family who raises you matters more than the biology that creates you. But mostly, I would tell him that he was wanted, protected, and loved beyond measure by people who would never see him as property to be controlled or a possession to be claimed. Tyler had lost his son the moment he chose violence over love, but Lucas had gained something far more valuable: the absolute certainty that he was worth protecting, that his safety mattered more than anyone's ego, and that there were people in the world who would sacrifice anything to keep him safe. The sun was setting over the Gulf of Mexico, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the water like liquid fire. Somewhere in North Carolina, Tyler was counting down the months until his release, probably planning how he would rebuild his life and regain the control he'd lost. But here in our beach cottage in Florida, Lucas was sleeping peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by people who loved him without conditions, protected by legal orders and military authority, and the fierce determination of a mother who had learned the difference between love and possession. Tyler could serve his time and complete his probation, and spend the rest of his life trying to justify his actions to anyone who would listen. But Lucas Morrison would grow up free from his father's influence, safe from his violence, and surrounded by the kind of love that protected rather than possessed, that nurtured rather than controlled, that celebrated rather than diminished. And that, I realized as I turned off the porch light and headed inside to check on my sleeping son one more time, was the only victory that really mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.